The Carousel, a tale of fate and the inevitable turn. The carnival did not arrive with a bang, but with a whisper. It unfurled at the edge of town like a strange and beautiful weed, sprouting overnight in the vacant lot where the old mill had once burned down. It was called Ethelred's peregrinating pantheon of wonders, a name so grand and archaic it felt like a secret. There were no blaring speakers, no garish neon. Instead, the air hummed with the faint, discordant melody of a calliope, and the lights were soft, gas-fired globes that flickered with a life of their own. It was a carnival woven from twilight and memory, and it called to Elara with a force she could not explain. She was 17, a girl poised on the precipice of her own life, feeling the vast, terrifying expanse of her future yawning before her. Every choice, university, a trade, staying in this town that felt both suffocating and safe, seemed to branch into infinite possibilities, a labyrinth with no center. The weight of it all, the sheer maybe of everything, was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety in her veins. So when the carnival appeared, a pocket of defined, enchanting certainty in her uncertain world, she was drawn to it as if by a physical law. She went alone on a Thursday evening when the sky was the color of a day-old bruise. The path to the vacant lot was lined with oaks, whose branches intertwined like skeletal fingers, and the air was cool and carried the scent of damp earth and spun sugar. As she passed under the wrought iron archway, the sounds of the mundane world, distant traffic, a barking dog, simply faded away, replaced by the carnival's intimate symphony. The soft creak of wood, the murmur of a small crowd, the eternal, looping waltz of the calliope. It was a place out of time. A strong man with kind eyes and a handlebar mustache lifted weights that seemed carved from obsidian. A fortune teller sat behind a bead curtain, her eyes closed, not beckoning customers, but simply waiting. Vendors sold candied apples that glistened like jewels and hot chocolate that steamed with the scent of cinnamon and ghost stories. But Elara's gaze was pulled irresistibly to the heart of the carnival, the Carousel. It was the most magnificent thing she had ever seen. It wasn't large, but it was dense with detail, a masterpiece of wood and paint and hidden mechanics. It was named the Mnemosyne, after the Greek Titaness of memory. Its canopy was a deep, velvety blue, dotted with constellations that, if you stared long enough, seemed to shift and swirl. The platform was a rich mahogany, and rising from it were not just horses, but a menagerie of fantastical creatures. A griffin with feathers of gold leaf, a dragon with scales of emerald green, a unicorn with a spiraled horn of mother of pearl. And there were horses, too, each one more breathtaking than the last. But these were not the simple, prancing steeds of a typical fairground ride. These were narrative vessels. Each figure was a frozen moment in a story, its tale told not in words, but in the intricate paintings that adorned its saddle, its flanks, its very being. A young boy was climbing onto a lion whose painted side showed a tiny figure facing down a giant in a field of wheat, the story of David and Goliath. A couple shared a two-seater swan, its wings depicting a scene of a masked ball and a lost slipper, Cinderella. The Carousel was a library of legends, a gallery of fables, all set to the slow, majestic, and utterly relentless rotation of the platform. Elara stood by the railing, mesmerized. The operator was a wizened old man with skin like tanned leather, and eyes the color of a calm sea. He didn't speak, merely nodding as patrons mounted their chosen steeds. He wore a faded waistcoat embroidered with celestial patterns, and his hands, when he moved the brass lever to start the ride, were steady and sure. The carousel began to turn. It didn't jerk into motion, it unfurled, its pace stately, hypnotic. The calliope's music swelled, a haunting, complex piece that was more symphony than simple tune. And as it turned, the magic began. The painted scenes on the animals didn't just stay static. They moved. They bled into one another, telling their stories in a silent, looping film. On the lion, the painted David swung his sling. The giant tumbled, and the crowd of Israelites cheered, their tiny faces alive with triumph. On the swan, Cinderella danced, fled at midnight, and was found again by the prince, the sequence repeating with every full rotation. The stories were circular, eternal. They always ended where they began, ready to be told again. There was a profound comfort in this, Elara thought. No matter the peril, the heartbreak, or the struggle, the story was guaranteed. Its outcome was fixed. It was inevitable. Her eyes scanned the circling menagerie, and then they stopped. There, slightly apart from the others, was a horse. It was a stallion, carved from wood so dark it seemed to drink the light, a stark contrast to the vibrant whites, chestnuts, and golds of the other creatures. Its mane was wild, flowing, as if caught in a perpetual gale, and its eyes, crafted from chips of obsidian, held a deep, intelligent sorrow. It was unmounted, and for a reason Elara immediately understood. The paintings on this horse were different. They weren't myths or fairy tales. They were modern, photorealistic. The saddle was painted with a scene of a little girl with chestnut hair, not unlike Elara's own, playing in a sandbox behind a familiar-looking house, her house. On its flank was a depiction of that same girl, older now, crying in a school bathroom, a memory so private and sharp it made Elara's breath catch. Further along the horse's powerful neck was a scene of her, just last month, arguing with her mother at the kitchen table. And then, on its hindquarters, a painting of her here now, standing at this very railing, her face a mask of wonder. This horse was telling her story, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. This was impossible. A trick of the light, a coincidence, a waking dream. But the details were too precise. The specific pattern of her childhood dress, the chipped tooth she'd had at age 9, the way she'd tucked her hair behind her ear during that argument with her mother. This was no generic girl. It was her. carousel completed its turn. The music began to slow, the platform easing to a gentle halt. The other riders, laughing and chattering, dismounted and wandered off into the carnival, their own stories continuing. Elara stood frozen, her knuckles white on the railing. The old operator's eyes met hers across the platform. He didn't look surprised. He looked resigned. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod towards the dark horse. Trembling, Elara stepped over the low barrier and onto the platform. The carved wood felt warm beneath her feet, as if alive with a low current. She approached the dark stallion. Up close, the paintings were even more unnerving. They were her life, a biography in miniature, scrolling across the creature's form. She saw her first kiss, her grandfather's funeral, the day she got her acceptance, led her to a college 3 states away, a secret she had told no one. Her eyes traced the narrative along the horse's body, moving from past to present, from the saddle towards the powerful, arched neck, and the head that was yet to be fully revealed by the carousel's turn. The story was all there, the tapestry of her 17 years. And then her gaze reached the point just behind the horse's head, the part of the narrative that would represent her immediate future. The painting showed her, clear as a photograph, mounting this very horse. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a dreadful fascination. The detail was exquisite. She could see the individual threads in her jacket, the faint smudge of ink on her thumb. This was the choice she was making. Her breath hitched. This was madness. She should turn, run, forget this cursed carnival and its psychic carousel. But the pull was stronger than fear. It was the pull of a story nearing its climax. It was the need to know how it ended. If the story was already written, what was the point of running? To see it, to know it, that was the only power left. With a hand that shook, she reached out and touched the horse's dark flank. The wood was not cold, but warm, and she felt a faint thrum, a heartbeat. She put her foot into the stirrup, a delicate thing of wrought iron, and swung her leg over the saddle. It was carved to fit her perfectly. She settled into place, her hands gripping the cold, hard pole that speared up through the horse back. The old operator watched her. He made no move to collect a ticket. He simply placed his hand on the brass lever and pulled. The Mnemosyne began to turn. The world outside the platform, the carnival, the twilight, the watching eyes of the operator began to slide away, blurring at the edges as if she were looking through a poorly focused lens. The calliope music was the only sound, now deafening, filling her skull, vibrating in her teeth. She was locked in, a prisoner of the narrative. She looked down at the horse. The paintings were moving. The scene of her mounting the horse was now behind her, part of the past. The new images, unfurling on the horse's neck just before her, were of the immediate future. She saw herself, on this ride, gripping the pole, her face a mask of dread. She saw the carousel turn once, twice. She saw herself dismount, her legs unsteady, her face pale. She saw herself stumbling from the platform, the old operator giving her that same sad nod. A flicker of hope, wild and irrational, sparked in her chest. She would get off. She would survive this. The story would continue. She leaned forward, desperate to see more, to see herself leaving the carnival, going home, living her life. The paintings flowed like a river, each moment a ripple on its surface. She saw herself walking home through the dark, oak-lined path. The air was cold. She saw herself lying in her bed that night, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She saw the dawn come, pale and weak through her window. She saw herself going through the motions of the next day, haunted, distant. She saw herself, 2 days from now, telling her best friend about the carnival, the words tumbling out in a frantic, disbelieving rush. The story was continuing. Her future was unfolding before her eyes, a silent, beautiful, terrifying film. She saw a potential first day at university, the lecture halls vast and intimidating. She saw a man's face, kind and smiling, a future love. She saw herself older, in an apartment she didn't recognize, writing at a desk. A writer. Was that her fate? A part of her recoiled at this violation, at having her choices, her secrets, her joys and sorrows laid bare before they had even happened. But a larger part was seduced by the certainty. The anxiety of the maybe was gone, replaced by the terrible peace of the will be. The carousel completed its second rotation. The music played on. The painted future continued to stream past. The scenes began to change in tone. The hopeful, if anxious, images of a life being lived started to curdle. The painting of the kind-faced man was now followed by a scene of a furious argument, a slammed door. The image of her writing at the desk was replaced by one of her tearing up pages, her face contorted in frustration. She saw moments of loneliness, of failure, of sickness. The carousel was not just showing her a highlight reel, it was showing her the whole, unvarnished truth. The pain was as inevitable as the joy. She wanted to close her eyes, but she couldn't. She was chained to the narrative. The carousel turned and turned and turned. She saw herself at 30, at 40. She saw lines form on her face, saw her hair begin to be threaded with silver. She saw moments of profound, quiet happiness holding a child. The painting was ambiguous, a silhouette in a doorway. She saw loss. She saw her parents grow old and pass away, their funerals depicted with brutal, silent clarity. The ride was no longer a thrilling glimpse into destiny. It was an ordeal. It was the entirety of a human life, compressed into a few minutes, the emotional peaks and valleys flattened into a relentless, monotonous march. The circular motion, once hypnotic, was now nauseating. She was trapped on this wheel, forced to watch the sum of her existence, from its insignificant beginnings to its end. The thought was an ice-cold spike in her gut. She had been so captivated by the story that she had forgotten the premise of her own terror. The girl had realized the carousel showed her death. She looked frantically at the paintings ahead. The narrative was progressing faster now, the images flickering past. a life accelerating towards its conclusion. She saw herself as an old woman, her back bent, her hands gnarled with arthritis, sitting on a porch and looking out at a sunset. There was a peace to it, a natural end, a completion. Maybe that was it. A quiet death in old age. The dread in her heart loosened its grip slightly. She could accept that. To see a full life, a long life, was a gift, even if it revealed all the heartache in between. The carousel turned, bringing the final segment of the horse's narrative into view. The part just before the loop began again, where the horse's head met its tail. The final chapter. But the painting of the old woman on the porch was not the last one. The images that followed were confusing, disjointed. They were not of old age. They were of now. Of her as she was now 17 years old. She saw a scene of a storm, trees whipping in a ferocious wind. She saw the carnival, but it was in disarray. A tent collapsing, the gas lights sputtering. She saw the carousel, still turning, but now it was surrounded not by a cheerful crowd, but by swirling leaves and darkness. And then she saw it, the final painting. It was on the horse's head, right between its obsidian eyes. It was a depiction of the carousel itself. And on the carousel was the dark horse, and on the dark horse was her. But she wasn't sitting upright. She was slumped forward, her head against the pole, her chestnut hair streaming down like a waterfall. Her eyes were open, but they were vacant, the light gone from them. There was no visible wound, no violence, just an end. The stillness of the painted figure was absolute and horrifying. The moment of her death was not in some distant, abstract future. It was on this ride. A silent scream built in her throat. She tried to stand, to throw herself from the moving platform, but her body would not obey. She was paralyzed, locked in the saddle by the same force that was propelling the narrative forward. She was a character in the last paragraph of her own story, and she had no agency to change a single word. The carousel was beginning its final rotation. The music, which had been building in a slow crescendo, began to incorporate a dissonant, grinding chord. The painted scenes around her were no longer just moving, they were bleeding, the colors running like wet ink. The story of her life was dissolving into chaos. She looked out at the carnival. The operator was gone. The other patrons were gone. The gas lights flickered and died, one by one, plunging the world into a deep, velvety blackness, punctuated only by the swirling, malevolent constellations on the carousel's canopy. The wind began to howl, a sound that wasn't in the paintings, but was now all around her, tearing at her clothes, whipping her hair. The carousel was turning faster now, no longer stately, but frantic, a dizzying, sickening whirl. The calliope was a screaming thing, the beautiful waltz corrupted into a cacophony of shattered notes. The painted horses and griffins and dragons around her seemed to snarl and writhe, their stories twisting into nightmares. She was at the center of the storm, on the back of the dark horse, hurtling towards the final image. She could see it up ahead, the painting of her own lifeless body growing larger, more detailed, more real with every second. This was the inevitability. This was the fate she had chosen to look upon. The circular story demanded a conclusion so it could begin again. Her life was the tale, and the carousel required an ending. She closed her eyes, not against the visual, but against the terror. She thought of the infinite maybe she had so feared. She would have given anything for it now, for the terrifying, beautiful uncertainty of a life uncharted. The weight of a known future was infinitely heavier than the weight of an unknown one. The carousel reached its maximum speed, becoming a blur of light and sound and nightmare. The world was a vortex, and she was being pulled into its center. The image of her death was no longer a painting on a horse. It was a doorway, and she was flying towards it. She felt a final, searing jolt, not of pain, but of absolute understanding. A completion. And then silence. The carousel slowed. The frantic spinning gentled into a slow, graceful turn. The dissonant music softened, resolved, and melted back into the gentle, haunting waltz. The wind died down. The gas lights flickered back to life. The Mnemosyne completed its turn and came to a smooth, perfect stop. On the platform, the menagerie was still. The lion showed David, sling in hand, forever ready. The swan showed Cinderella, mid-dance, forever hopeful. And on the dark horse, the girl was slumped forward, her head resting against the cold brass pole, her chestnut hair cascading down. Her eyes were open, but they saw nothing. The story was complete. The old operator stepped out from the shadows, his face a landscape of 1,000 such nights. He walked slowly to the dark horse and looked at the final, terrible painting. It was now static once more. It showed exactly what had just transpired. The loop was closed. With a tenderness that belied his worn appearance, he reached out and gently closed the girl's eyes. He did not look surprised. He did not look sad. He looked like a reader closing a book after finishing a powerful, tragic story. It was a story that was, and therefore had to be. He turned and walked back to his lever. In the distance, a new patron was approaching the railing, a young man with a troubled, searching look in his eyes. His gaze swept over the carousel, over the griffin, the dragon, the unicorn, and then stopped. It lingered on a different horse, one carved from pale, ash-colored wood, its flanks painted with scenes from a life that was not yet lived, but was already written. The operator placed his hand on the brass lever. The carousel was ready to turn again. The stories were waiting. They were always waiting, and they were, every one of them, inevitable. Analysis, the machinery of fate. The carousel is more than a ghost story. It is a Gothic meditation on the most profound and unsettling of human concepts. Fate. It uses the visceral horror of precognition to explore the psychological terror of determinism. The idea that our paths are set, our choices illusory, and our endings fixed long before we live them. 1. The lure of certainty in an uncertain world. Elara is a quintessential modern protagonist, paralyzed by the tyranny of choice. Her anxiety isn't about a lack of options, but an overabundance of them. The carnival, and specifically the carousel, offers a perverse antidote to this anxiety: the comfort of a pre-written narrative. This speaks to a deep human desire to believe that our lives have a structure, a plot, a meaning that transcends our chaotic daily decisions. We are drawn to horoscopes, personality tests, and religious doctrines for the same reason Elara is drawn to the dark horse. We want to know that our story makes sense. The horror arises when we get what we wish for and discover that the script includes not only our triumphs, but our suffering, and ultimately, our final curtain call. 2. Circular storytelling and the inevitable loop. The very structure of the carousel is the story's central metaphor. A circle has no beginning and no end. It simply is. The narratives it tells, David and Goliath, Cinderella, are myths whose outcomes we know by heart. Their power lies in their repetition, their fixed nature. By placing Elara's personal, unique life into this same circular structure, the story argues that she is no different from these archetypal figures. Her life is just another myth playing out on a cosmic wheel. The looping motion is relentless. It cannot be stopped, only paused. It suggests that time itself is a cycle, and we are merely passengers on a ride we cannot control. Elara's attempt to break free is futile because she is not an actor on the stage, but a painted figure on the carousel itself. Her rebellion was always part of the painting. 3. The visual hook, symbolism in motion. The visual elements are not mere set dressing. They are the engine of the theme. The Mnemosyne, named for the tightness of memory, the carousel suggests that the future is not being created, but remembered. Elara's life is already a recorded event in the ledger of time, and the carousel is merely the playback device. The dark horse, a classic symbol of mystery and death. Its separation from the brighter, mythic creatures signifies that personal, mundane fate is often darker and more intimate than the grand tales of heroes. Its obsidian eyes see nothing and everything, reflecting the void that awaits at the end of the narrative. The moving paintings. This is the genius of the visual hook. It transforms the static concept of fate into a dynamic, observable process. We, like Elara, are seduced by the beauty of the storytelling, only to be crushed by its inexorable progression. The shift from beautiful, hopeful images to painful, tragic ones mirrors life's own cruel bait-and-switch. The final image, a meta-depiction of her own death on the ride, creates a terrifying, inescapable loop, a snake eating its own tail. The operator, he is not a malevolent force, but a functionary. He is the priest of this temple, the projectionist in the cinema of fate. His lack of emotion is not cruelty, but the neutrality of a natural law. He doesn't cause the stories, he merely sets them in motion. For fate versus free will, the ultimate horror, the true terror of the carousel, is not the depiction of death, but the annihilation of free will. Elara's choice to mount the horse feels like an act of agency, but the paintings reveal that this choice was itself predetermined. She was always going to choose to see. This is the most devastating form of fate, one that accounts for our own rebellions against it. The story poses a haunting question. If you could know your future, would you want to? And if you did, would that knowledge itself become the very instrument that locks that future into place? Elara's horrified realization that her death is imminent on the ride is what paralyzes her, ensuring she cannot dismount, thus fulfilling the prophecy. Her knowledge of fate becomes the mechanism of its enactment. In the end, the carousel leaves us with a chilling conclusion. The stories continue, the wheel turns, and new riders will always step forward, drawn by the siren song of a story they can call their own. We are all, perhaps, riding our own dark horses, glimpsing fragments of our narrative in dreams and déjà vus, hopping for a happy ending, but forever trapped within the beautiful, terrible, and inevitable machinery of our own existence. The music never stops. It only waits for the next rider to take their seat.